"You'll get nothing from my mother's estate, old man." My stepson Donovan sneered at me during Victoria's funeral reception, his voice low enough that the other mourners couldn't hear, but loud enough to cut straight through my grief. I stood there in my modest black suit, still numb from losing the love of my life, while he promised to make sure I'd be left with nothing from the $10 million fortune my wife had built over 30 years of brilliant business decisions. 2 weeks later, sitting in that courthouse, listening to the judge read a second will that Donovan never knew existed, I watched his arrogant face crumble as Victoria had the last word from beyond the grave. If you've ever been dismissed as worthless by people who never bothered to understand your worth, if you've ever had someone assume the worst about your intentions because your bank account was smaller than theirs, then settle in, friend. Because this is a story about love that transcends money, about assumptions that destroy families, and about justice that sometimes comes with interest compounded over 12 beautiful years. I'm Nate, and what happened in that courtroom proved that my wife knew exactly who deserved her trust and who deserved her disappointment. Victoria had been gone for 3 weeks when Donovan summoned me to his law office for the reading of the will, treating me like a bothersome appointment that needed to be handled efficiently. I sat in that leather chair wearing the same suit I'd worn to our wedding 12 years earlier, my hands folded in my lap, while Donovan's colleagues watched me with barely concealed curiosity. They were probably wondering what this simple man had done to convince a real estate mogul to marry him. The will Donovan read that day left me $50,000 for his years of companionship to my mother, while everything else, the properties, the business, the investment accounts worth millions, went directly to him. As he read those words, I could hear the smugness in his voice, could see the satisfied looks on the faces of the other lawyers who'd probably helped him craft this moment of public humiliation. I was being dismissed like a paid companion whose services were no longer needed. But here's the thing about spending 40 years as a librarian. You learn to read people as carefully as you read books, and you develop an appreciation for plot twists that come when you least expect them. Victoria had been the smartest woman I'd ever known, and she understood her son better than he understood himself. If you think that brilliant, loving woman would leave her devoted husband of 12 years, defenseless, against the greed she'd watched growing in Donovan for decades, then you underestimated the depth of her love and the sharpness of her legal mind. The real story began 2 days later when Eleanor Hartley, a lawyer I'd never met, knocked on my apartment door with a briefcase full of documents and a smile that suggested she'd been waiting years to deliver this particular piece of news. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I was your wife's private attorney, and I have something that belongs to you, something that's going to change everything Donovan thinks he knows about his mother's final wishes." Deal. That briefcase contained not just a second will, but love letters Victoria had written to me over the years, detailed explanations of her business decisions, and a foundation she'd established in both our names that would ensure her legacy lived on through the literacy programs we'd both been passionate about. She'd known exactly what her son would try to do, and she'd spent months preparing the perfect response to his greed and cruelty. If you're someone who believes that true love finds a way to protect itself even after death, if you think that people who judge others based on their bank statements rather than their character deserve to learn some expensive lessons, then stick around. Because what happened next proved that my wife's final gift wasn't just money, it was justice served with the precision of a woman who'd spent her life outmaneuvering people who underestimated her. If you're enjoying this story about love, loyalty, and the kind of legal plot twist that makes arrogant people very sorry for their assumptions, go ahead and subscribe to Grandpa's Diaries. I've got more tales about the difference between what people think they deserve and what they actually earn through their actions. Victoria and I met in the most ordinary way possible. She was researching property records for a commercial development project, and I was the librarian helping her navigate the municipal archives that held decades of ownership transfers and zoning changes. She arrived at my desk every Tuesday morning for 6 weeks, always impeccably dressed, always polite, always focused on her work, with the kind of intensity that suggested every detail mattered to her success. What struck me wasn't her obvious success or her elegant appearance. It was the way she treated everyone in the library with the same respect she'd show a business partner. She learned the names of the cleaning staff. She remembered that Mrs. Patterson on the reference desk had grandchildren, and she always said please and thank you like they were important words instead of social formalities. In a world full of people who measured others by their usefulness, Victoria measured them by their humanity. Our first real conversation happened when she stayed late one evening, frustrated because she couldn't find a particular survey map that was crucial to her project. I'd stayed after hours to help her search through boxes of archived documents, and somewhere between dusty file folders and hand-drawn property lines from the 1940s, we started talking about more than just real estate. She asked about my work, my love of books, my quiet life in my small apartment surrounded by the novels and poetry collections I'd been gathering for decades. "You know what I envy about your life, Nate," she said, as we finally found the map she'd been searching for. "You're surrounded by stories every day, but you're not trying to sell them or profit from them. You just love them for what they are." I'd never thought of my work as enviable. Most people saw librarians as quietly irrelevant, keepers of information that the internet had made obsolete. But Victoria saw something different, something valuable in the way I approached knowledge and learning. Our courtship unfolded slowly, over 18 months of Tuesday morning research sessions that gradually extended into coffee breaks, then lunch conversations, then Saturday afternoon walks through the historic district where she was considering buying and renovating old buildings. She'd tell me about her business challenges, her dreams of creating mixed-use developments that brought communities together instead of just generating profit. I'd share recommendations for books about urban planning, about the social impact of architecture, about the way spaces shape the people who inhabit them. The night she proposed, yes, she proposed to me, we were sitting in her car outside my apartment building, having just returned from dinner at a small Italian restaurant where we'd spent 3 hours talking about everything except the obvious attraction that had been building between us for months. "Nate," she said, turning to face me with that direct gaze that made important business decisions look easy. "I've spent my whole adult life being careful, being strategic, making smart investments. But falling in love with you feels like the first really wise thing I've done." I was 58 years old, had never been married, had resigned myself to a quiet life of books and solitude, when this remarkable woman decided that what she wanted most in the world was to build a life with a small-town librarian who owned more books than furniture. Our wedding was small but perfect, just close friends and a few family members, including Donovan, who attended but spent the entire reception making comments about prenuptial agreements and the wisdom of protecting family assets from outside influences. But Victoria never saw our marriage as a business transaction or a risk that needed to be managed. She saw it as the missing piece of a life that had been successful but not complete, profitable but not fulfilled. For 12 years, we proved that love doesn't require similar bank accounts. It requires similar values, shared dreams, and the kind of respect that grows stronger when it's tested by time and the opinions of people who can't understand what they're witnessing. From the very beginning, Donovan made it clear that he saw me as a threat to his inheritance, rather than a stepfather who genuinely loved his mother. He was 33 when Victoria and I married, already established in his law practice and accustomed to being the only important man in his mother's life. Our wedding reception was the first time I saw him calculate the cost of my presence in their family, his eyes narrowing every time Victoria laughed at something I said or touched my arm affectionately during conversations. The holidays became battlegrounds where Donovan would test the boundaries of our relationship, making comments about new family traditions that didn't include me or family business discussions that I wasn't qualified to understand. He'd arrive at Victoria's house with expensive gifts and pointed observations about how much simpler life had been before she'd complicated things with romance at her age. Victoria would shut him down firmly but gently, trying to maintain peace while making it clear that I belonged in her life permanently. When Victoria included me in business conversations, Donovan would find ways to undermine my contributions, suggesting that my academic background wasn't relevant to real-world financial decisions. He'd explain basic business concepts to me in the condescending tone lawyers use with difficult witnesses, apparently forgetting that I'd spent decades managing library budgets, grant applications, and municipal funding negotiations. His goal was always the same, to make me feel like an outsider who didn't belong in his mother's sophisticated world. The worst part was watching Victoria navigate the tension between her son's hostility and her desire to integrate me into all aspects of her life. She'd invite both of us to business dinners with her partners and clients, hoping that Donovan would eventually see me as an asset rather than a liability. Instead, he'd spend these evenings highlighting our differences: his expensive suit versus my department store blazer, his law degree versus my library science education, his inherited understanding of business versus my learned appreciation for Victoria's work. Victoria tried to address the problem directly several times, having private conversations with Donovan about respect and family loyalty, but he'd always apologize just enough to avoid real consequences while never actually changing his behavior toward me. He was too smart to openly attack me in front of his mother, but he was also too entitled to accept that I wasn't going anywhere. The result was a Cold War that lasted 12 years, with Victoria caught in the middle, trying to love both of us despite our inability to coexist peacefully. The attacks became more subtle as the years passed, but never less hurtful. Donovan would mention family financial planning conversations that excluded me, suggest that Victoria's will needed to be updated to protect the business interests she'd worked so hard to build, and occasionally make jokes about May-December romances that weren't quite loud enough to be confrontational, but weren't quiet enough to be missed. Each comment was designed to plant seeds of doubt about my motivations and my place in Victoria's life. What Donovan never understood was that his behavior actually brought Victoria and me closer together. She saw how I handled his hostility with dignity rather than defensiveness, how I never asked her to choose between us, how I continued to treat him with courtesy, despite his obvious contempt for me. "You're a better man than I deserve," she told me one evening after Donovan had been particularly cruel during a family dinner. "And certainly a better man than he is, despite all his advantages and education." But I could see the stress it caused her. The way she'd get quiet and distant after particularly tense family gatherings, the way she'd apologize for his behavior even though I never asked her to. I began to suspect that Victoria was making plans to protect our relationship from Donovan's future interference, but I never imagined the extent of her preparations or the depth of her understanding about what would happen after she was gone. The heart attack that took Victoria came without warning on a Thursday afternoon while she was reviewing contracts in her home office. I found her there 2 hours later when I returned from my weekly volunteer shift at the Community Literacy Center, slumped over the desk where she'd built her empire one deal at a time. The paramedics said she'd died instantly, that she probably hadn't suffered, but I stood in that doorway, looking at the woman who'd made my life complete, and felt like my own heart was breaking into irreparable pieces. Donovan arrived at the hospital before the doctors had even finished their official pronouncements, taking charge of the situation with the kind of professional efficiency that made me feel like an unnecessary observer of my own wife's death. He spoke to the medical staff, handled the paperwork, made the initial phone calls to business associates and family members, all while treating me like a confused elderly relative who needed to be managed rather than the grieving widower who'd just lost his soulmate. The funeral arrangements became Donovan's project, planned and executed according to his vision of what would be appropriate for a woman of Victoria's stature in the business community. He chose the funeral home, selected the casket, wrote the obituary, and planned the reception without consulting me about any detail, as if my 12 years of marriage to his mother had given me no standing in decisions about how to honor her memory. When I tried to suggest that Victoria would have preferred a smaller, more intimate service focused on the literacy programs she'd supported rather than the business achievements she'd accomplished, Donovan looked at me with undisguised irritation. "Nate, he said, using the tone he might use with a persistent child. My mother was a prominent businesswoman with responsibilities to the community that went far beyond your little book projects. This funeral needs to reflect her real accomplishments, not her hobbies. The service itself was beautiful but cold, filled with business associates who spoke about Victoria's professional success and community leadership while barely mentioning the private woman who'd spent her evenings reading novels I recommended and her weekends volunteering at literacy programs for adult learners. I sat in the front row, feeling like a stranger at the funeral of someone I'd thought I knew completely, listening to eulogies that described a woman I recognized but didn't fully capture the person I'd loved. But it was during the reception afterward that Donovan showed me exactly what the future would hold. As guests offered their condolences and shared their memories, he positioned himself as the primary mourner, accepting sympathy and making plans for handling mother's affairs, with the authority of someone who'd already assumed control. When people asked about me, he'd introduce me as my mother's husband, rather than my stepfather, creating a subtle but clear distinction that made me sound temporary rather than permanent. The final insult came when most of the guests had left and we were standing in the funeral home's reception area, surrounded by flower arrangements that would be donated to hospitals the next day. Donovan approached me with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully managed a difficult event, ready to tie up loose ends and move forward with his plans. "You know, Nate," he said, adjusting his expensive tie and looking around the nearly empty room, "we should probably discuss your living situation soon. Mother's house will need to be sold, of course, and I'm sure you'll want to find something more suitable for a man in your circumstances." His words were polite enough, but his meaning was crystal clear. I was being evicted from the life I'd built with Victoria, dismissed like an employee whose services were no longer required. When I started to respond, to remind him that Victoria and I had been married for 12 years and that I had legal rights as her surviving spouse, Donovan held up his hand to stop me. "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, his lawyer's training evident in every word. "You'll get what's appropriate, but let's be realistic about your actual contribution to Mother's success. Some men marry for love, others marry for convenience. Either way, the party's over now." Lee. 2 weeks after the funeral, Donovan summoned me to his law office for the formal reading of Victoria's will, and I walked into that mahogany-paneled conference room feeling like a defendant about to receive a verdict. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Donovan had invited several business associates who'd been named as minor beneficiaries, creating an audience for whatever humiliation he had planned for me. I sat in the chair closest to the door, wearing my best suit and trying to maintain dignity while the other attendees made small talk about Victoria's business acumen and the challenge of managing such a complex estate. Donovan sat at the head of the conference table like a judge preparing to deliver justice, surrounded by legal documents and looking entirely too pleased with the situation. His colleagues from the law firm flanked him on either side, their expressions carefully neutral, but their curiosity obvious. When Donovan began reading the will, his voice carried the formal authority of someone accustomed to controlling important moments. The document was lengthy and complex, filled with legal terminology that made every bequest sound like a business transaction rather than a final expression of love and gratitude. Property after property, investment after investment, business interest after business interest. Everything Victoria had built over 30 years of brilliant work was being distributed according to Donovan's understanding of her wishes. The other beneficiaries received generous gifts that reflected Victoria's appreciation for their contributions to her success. Her longtime business partner received a substantial cash bequest. Her assistant received enough money to buy a house. Her favorite charity received a donation that would fund operations for years. With each announcement, I felt smaller and more irrelevant, wondering if Victoria had somehow forgotten about the man who'd shared her bed and her dreams for 12 years. Finally, Donovan reached the section that addressed my inheritance, and his voice took on a tone of magnanimous charity that made my skin crawl. "To my husband, Nathaniel Whitmore," he read, pausing dramatically to make sure everyone in the room was paying attention. I leave the sum of $50,000 in recognition of his companionship during our marriage, along with my gratitude for the comfort he provided during my later years. The room fell silent, except for the sound of air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic outside the office windows. $50,000. Less than Victoria had spent on her car, less than she'd donated to charity the previous year, less than she'd paid in property taxes on the house we'd shared. The amount wasn't just insulting, it was a public declaration that my 12-year marriage had been worth approximately $4,000 per year of companionship. Donovan continued reading the will, explaining that all remaining assets, the real estate empire worth millions, the investment portfolios, the business interests, everything that represented Victoria's life's work, would pass directly to him as her only child and natural heir. As he spoke, I could see the satisfied glances exchanged between the lawyers, could feel the weight of their judgment about the old man who'd apparently overestimated his importance to a wealthy woman. When the reading concluded, the other beneficiaries offered their condolences and left quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama they'd just witnessed. I remained seated, staring at the copy of the will Donovan had placed in front of me, trying to process how the woman who'd told me every day that she loved me could have reduced our relationship to a tip for services rendered. "Well, Nate," Donovan said as he gathered his documents, his tone mixing false sympathy with obvious satisfaction, "I think that settles everything fairly. 50,000 should be enough to help you transition to whatever comes next in your life. Mother was always generous, even with people who, well, let's just say she was generous." He stood up and straightened his suit jacket, ready to leave me alone with my humiliation and my shattered understanding of the woman I thought I'd known completely. I spent the next 2 days sitting in my small apartment, staring at the copy of Victoria's will and trying to understand how I'd been so wrong about everything. The woman who'd shared her dreams with me, who'd asked my opinion about business decisions, who'd held my hand during movies and told me I was the best thing that had ever happened to her, had apparently seen me as nothing more than a paid companion whose contract had expired with her death. The $50,000 was sitting in my checking account, but it felt like blood money, payment for services I'd thought were expressions of love, compensation for years I'd believed were a marriage, but were apparently just a business arrangement with emotional benefits. I'd been a fool, a lonely old man who'd mistaken kindness and convenience for genuine affection. And now, everyone who'd attended that will reading knew exactly how foolish I'd been. On Thursday morning, I was making coffee and contemplating whether I could afford to stay in my apartment on my librarian's pension when someone knocked on my front door. Through the peephole, I saw an elegant woman in her 60s, professionally dressed and carrying a leather briefcase. She didn't look like anyone I recognized, but there was something authoritative about her presence that made me think this visit was important. "Mr. Whitmore," she said when I opened the door, "my name is Eleanor Hartley, and I was your wife's private attorney. I apologize for not contacting you sooner, but I've been waiting for the appropriate legal time frame to pass before I could execute certain instructions Victoria left with me. May I come in? I have something that belongs to you." I invited her into my small living room, offering coffee that she politely declined while she surveyed my modest apartment with the kind of professional assessment lawyers make when they're evaluating situations. She sat on my worn couch and opened her briefcase, removing documents that looked far more substantial than the single-page copy of the will I'd been given at Donovan's office. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice gentle but businesslike, "I've been Victoria's private counsel for 15 years, handling personal matters that she preferred to keep separate from her business affairs. What Donovan read to you last week was indeed a valid will, but it wasn't her most recent will. Victoria updated her estate planning documents 6 months ago, and the new will tells a very different story about her intentions." She handed me a document that was significantly thicker than the will Donovan had read, and even upside down, I could see my name mentioned multiple times throughout the pages. Victoria suspected that Donovan might try to manipulate her estate planning, so she created what we call a backup will, with a different attorney, me, and she was very specific about when and how it should be revealed. She wanted to give Donovan enough rope to hang himself, legally speaking. Eleanor opened another folder and removed a stack of handwritten letters, all addressed to me in Victoria's familiar script. "She also left you these," she said, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "Love letters that explain her reasoning, her feelings about your marriage, and her thoughts about the kind of man her son had become. She wanted you to know that every day of your 12-year marriage was precious to her, and that her final act of love was protecting you from Donovan's greed and cruelty." As I held those letters in my hands, I felt something break open in my chest. Not the sharp pain of betrayal I'd been carrying for days, but the relief of understanding that the woman I'd loved hadn't betrayed me after all. Victoria had been playing a longer game, setting up a situation where Donovan would reveal his true character while she arranged to have the last word about who deserved her trust and who deserved her disappointment. "There's going to be a hearing next Tuesday," Eleanor explained, "where I'll present the real will to the court. Donovan will contest it, of course, but Victoria was very thorough in documenting her mental competency and her reasons for the changes. She also included some very specific language about what should happen if anyone tries to challenge her final wishes based on claims that you manipulated or coerced her." The courthouse hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and I arrived early, wearing the same suit I'd worn to Victoria's funeral, but feeling entirely different about my place in the story being told. Eleanor met me at the courthouse steps, carrying multiple briefcases and looking like a general prepared for a battle she'd been planning for months. "Are you ready for this, Nate?" she asked. "Because what happens today is going to change everything Donovan thinks he knows about his mother's opinion of him." Donovan arrived with his own legal team, clearly confident that this hearing would be a formality to dismiss whatever nuisance claim I was making against his mother's estate. He nodded at me with the condescending politeness of someone humoring a delusional old man, probably assuming that I'd hired some desperate lawyer to contest the will based on emotional arguments rather than legal facts. When the judge called the case, Eleanor stood and presented the second will with the calm authority of someone who'd been waiting years to deliver this particular piece of justice. "Your Honor," she said, "I represent Mr. Nathaniel Whitmore, the surviving spouse of Victoria Pemberton Whitmore, and I'm here to present Mrs. Whitmore's final and most recent will, executed 6 months after the document that was read to Mr. Whitmore by the deceased's son." I watched Donovan's face as Eleanor read the real will, saw his expression change from confident dismissal to confused concern to dawning horror as he realized what his mother had actually done. The new will left the majority of Victoria's estate to me, including the house we'd shared, the real estate portfolio she'd built, and control of the charitable foundation she'd established in both our names. Donovan received a trust fund that would provide him with a comfortable income, but no control over the principal. But the most devastating part came when Eleanor read Victoria's letter explaining her reasoning. "To my beloved son Donovan," she'd written, "I'm leaving you enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, but I'm not leaving you control of the empire I built because you've never understood that wealth is a responsibility, not a reward. Your treatment of Nate has shown me that you measure people by their bank accounts rather than their character, and that's not the legacy I want to leave behind." The letter continued with words that cut through Donovan's arrogance like a surgeon's scalpel. "Nate has been the greatest blessing of my later years, not because of what he could give me, but because of who he chose to be every single day of our marriage. He loved me for my mind, my humor, and my heart, never asking for anything except the privilege of sharing my life. The fact that you could never see his value says more about your character than his." Donovan's lawyers tried to contest the will's validity, arguing that Victoria had been unduly influenced or mentally incompetent when she'd made the changes, but Eleanor was ready for every challenge. She presented medical records showing Victoria's perfect mental health, Witness statements from multiple people who'd observed our marriage over 12 years, and most damaging of all, recorded conversations where Donovan had made it clear that he was just waiting for his inheritance to begin. The judge ruled in favor of the second will, but the real victory came when Eleanor read Victoria's final message to her son. "I hope that losing the inheritance you took for granted will teach you the difference between love and entitlement, between family and ownership. Nate will be a better steward of this wealth than you ever would have been, because he understands that money is a tool for doing good, not a trophy for being born into the right family." 6 months later, I'm living in the house Victoria and I shared for 12 years, managing the charitable foundation we created together and funding literacy programs that she cared about as much as I do. Donovan still calls occasionally, usually when his trust fund payment isn't quite enough to cover his expensive lifestyle, but our conversations are brief and purely transactional. He learned too late that his mother's love wasn't unconditional and that disrespecting her husband was the same as disrespecting her. The best part isn't the money, though I'm grateful for the security it provides and the good work it allows me to do. The best part is knowing that Victoria understood exactly what our marriage meant to both of us, that she saw through her son's manipulations and protected the love we'd built together. The letters she left me are full of memories I'd forgotten and feelings she'd never fully expressed while she was alive, proof that our 12 years together were as precious to her as they were to me. Every morning, I read one of Victoria's letters with my coffee, and I can hear her voice in every word. She's still teaching me things about love, about family, about the difference between people who try to earn respect and people who think they deserve it without effort. She knew that Donovan would show his true colors after she died, and she made sure that when he did, there would be consequences for his cruelty and rewards for the man who'd loved her simply because she was lovable. If you've made it this far in my story, you understand that real love finds ways to protect itself even after death, and that people who judge others by their bank statements rather than their character usually end up learning expensive lessons about both. Leave me a comment about a time when someone underestimated you because of your circumstances, and don't forget to subscribe to Grandpa's Diaries for more stories about love, justice, and the beautiful art of proving wrong people very, very wrong. Until next time, remember that the most valuable inheritances aren't always monetary, and the people who love you for who you are will always find ways to show that love even when they're no longer here to say it out loud.